Psycholinguistics, another branch of interdisciplinary branches of linguistics. It discusses how language is represented and processed in the brain. So it's very important. It looks at the internal mechanism of language that takes place in our brain. So psycholinguistics is the study of the mental aspects of language and speech. How do we process language in our mind, and what happens when we speak, or obviously when we write. So it's concerned with the ways in which language is represented and processed in the brain. We process language in different ways. We have to think, we have to know, we have to understand. So it is known as the cognitive process. So it's very important for the linguist to know how all these things take place in our brain. It's a part of the field of cognitive science. So as I said, psycholinguistics is the part of cognitive science, and cognitive science basically studies how we perceive things, how we understand things, how we memorize things, how we make this thinking process in our mind. So psycholinguistics is the study of the mental mechanism that make it possible for people to use language. So how do sounds are combined in words, and words are combined in phrases and then in syntax, and how does a syntax gives a meaning, and what is the pragmatics of a certain linguistic entity. So this all is discussed under this in this field, psycholinguistics. It is also a scientific discipline whose goal is a coherent theory of the way in which language is produced and understood. So basically, psycholinguistics is concerned with giving a theory of language learning. First language learning as well as second language learning, and obviously how people produce language, how people comprehend language. There are two questions. What knowledge of language is needed for us to use language? For example, when we are reading a book, when we are giving a lecture, when we are writing a letter, so what type of language is required to us to do all these things? So we must know a language to use it, but we are not always fully aware of this knowledge. Though every speaker of a certain language must know his or her language, but most of the time we are not aware how language functions, how language works. What cognitive processes are involved in the ordinary use of language? As I said, what is the cognitive process of learning, of memorizing, when we are writing a letter, when we are reading a book, giving a lecture, or doing things like this, or having a conversation with other people? How language is done, how language is used. So it draws on ideas and knowledge from a number of associated areas. So to discuss how language is done, how we comprehend language, we get ideas from a number of fields of linguistics. Language acquisition. Two schools of thought as to how children acquire or learn language. This has been a very important question to man, that how language is learned, how do we use language. So there are two main schools. First says, the first theory states that all languages must be learned by the child. So this is a mentalistic approach by Piaget and his followers, that all language, a child has to learn all language, his mother language, right? Likewise, behaviorist F.B. Skinner also says that language is a behavior shaped by conditioned response. So these are mentalistic approaches, and contrary to this approach, the second view states that the abstract system of language cannot be learned, but that humans possess an innate language faculty or an access to what has been called universal grammar. So this is another view to language learning that says that language is so abstract that it is very difficult to learn a language, especially by a child in a very early years of his age. We know that by 4 years of his age, the language learning is at the peak, right? So it's a very abstract phenomenon. So how can a child learn a language only by listening to a language? So this approach, especially given by Chomsky, says that there is an innate learning capacity in human brain to learn language, which is universal. All people everywhere in the globe, in the world, have this ability to use language. So how people comprehend language, it is the very main question of the psycholinguistic, which part of the sentence that we listen to help us in comprehending the language, and how people produce language, and when we speak, what it is that help us in producing language, how sounds are clustered into words and into phrases, into clauses. So all this is, and how do we use language, the pragmatics of language. So these are very important questions for the psycholinguist. So neurolinguistics is also a part very close to psycholinguistics, which actually studies the functioning of the brain when the language is being used. Can language be an adequate medium of thought for philosophical inquiry? This has been a very pertinent question for the philosopher, that philosophy, so abstract, so complex, can be learned through language. So can language be an adequate medium for thought? So this is a very question. Whatever we think, can we explain it through a language? So psycholinguistics help us understanding the process of using a language, and it is in a try to answer such philosophical questions.